writing, though, I'm so engulfed in this story that I don't hear anything around me. I don't even realize that I'm writing. I don't even realize I'm in the room that I'm writing, and I'm completely engulfed in the story. And I've had people tap me on the shoulder, hey, dinner time. I'm like, huh, what? Oh, yeah, okay. You know, so or I'll be so much into writing. For example, when you're writing a story, how many people, have you guys written anything before? Have you've done some stuff? Then you know, if you're creating characters, you really see them as your children, you know. And in my trilogy here, the Prowley trilogy, I have a female character. In the beginning, she wasn't the main character. A monk was, with a sword and everything. It takes place in the Middle Ages. But eventually, through the trilogy, she becomes the main character in the end. And that's what happens to me. For me personally, 90% of my characters are female. I just gravitate to female characters. And I thought this one, the male character, it would be a male character, perfect. And then and being a female character, I tried my best. You know, or you know, so I'm writing, and I have to write the death of a character, you know, and I'm a drama queen. I'm a total drama queen, okay? And I'm a very sensitive guy, too, and I'm not ashamed to admit that. So I'll be writing, and I'm killing off this character, and I'm crying. Streams of tears come down my eyes, and I'm writing. And when I write, I use earphones, so I'm listening to classical music, but not like my favorite composers, Mozart and Tchaikovsky, both my two favorite composers. But I listen to soundtracks, because soundtracks, coming from writing movie scripts, when I'm writing books, it still puts me into that, you know, certain music. If I want a battle scene, I'm going to listen to music from Lord of the Rings or the Chronicles of Narnia films, things like that. So if I'm writing like a death scene, I was listening actually to the soundtrack of Atonement. You ever seen Atonement? And listening to, you know, soundtrack of Elephant Man, if you've ever seen that movie. And the Adagio for Strings, if you've ever heard that song, that's my favorite song. You want me to cry like that? You play that music, and I'm crying. So I'm listening to music, and I'm killing off this character. And inside my heart, I feel like something's also dying in me, you know. So I get really deep into it. But it's always been that way for me.
Why not keep them alive then? For a change.
Well, there's certain plot points. You know, there's a structure of plot points when you're writing a story. You know, you have to introduce usually how it goes, you introduce the hero. Chapter 1 is usually the hero, and then chapter 2 you're introducing the antagonist, you know, and then at certain points in the story, usually by chapter 4, you have to have the antagonist have a henchman usually, or another type of method to really attack the hero. So there's certain things you have to write in plot points in writing a book that's basically been there since the beginning of time, really, in regards to writing stories. And then, you know, at the end, the hero's victorious. That's the American version. The Russian version usually ends up everybody dies. It's a tragically sad thing. And I started writing short stories actually in this book. And then the second book of the trilogy, I have short stories in the back as bonuses. And someone told me, why would you put short stories after a main story? That's so unorthodox. I said, that's why I'm doing it. I want to be like the first, or, you know, one of the first. And that's why I'm doing it. Just like with this book, they came out with little credit card size, little cards with the book cover on it. It's something new that they're doing in the States to try to encourage reading, because we don't live in a reading society. We live in a movie, TV society, unfortunately. So these little cards, they put them around registers at Barnes & Noble. and someone sees the cover of the book, and they can buy the card, go home, and download the book right there on their computer. So, fortunately for me, my book's one of the first ones to do that. So, it's something that, to help Americans read more, actually, another avenue. So, so yeah, you have to kill, characters, not all of them. There are some stories where I haven't killed any characters.
Wow.
Short story I did. Well, actually, I did kill a character in a sense in that story, if you think about it, because anything can give you an inspiration when you're writing. Okay, and if you get mental blocks, sometimes you have to do drastic things to write again. For example, I'll give you both examples. I went to a museum in Los Gatos, California, and they had a historical museum there, and they had a little exhibit about grizzly bears. And I love animals, okay? I was, I don't know the name of the place, forgive me, but it was a giant monastery, and I went through these caves and saw many saints, and I loved it. And I'm thinking about writing a story about that place. And I was at this exhibit for grizzly bears. Well, anyways, I was there at the monastery, and I saw birds just kind of walking around, and people are kind of, get away, bird, get away. I love animals. And one of my favorite saints is St. Francis of Assisi. Right? I grew up with St. Francis, basically, because of my mom. And so I went into the little restaurant, bought some bread. Someone told me, don't feed the birds. Don't tell me what to do. I do what I want. That's the American thinking there. I've had cops tell me don't do something, and I still did it, okay? That's how bad I am. So I was there, and I was feeding the birds. And I got so much joy out of it, feeding the birds. And so that tells you how much I love animals. I don't know, I'm weird. I'd rather feed birds than people. Because I see people a lot of times as very destructive in nature, right? In human nature. And that's shown through human history. So they had this exhibit on grizzly bears, California grizzly bears, which now they say they're extinct. But if you've ever been to California, and if you've ever been up in the Sierra Mountains, those mountains are like endless. There are people who have flown private planes over the Sierras and have crashed, and they've never found the plane. It happened, the last one happened like 5 years ago. They still haven't found the plane. So that tells you how, there's a lot of wilderness in California, and I know when I was in Russia, they thought it was like the planet on Star Wars, Coruscant, where it was all city. And actually California is very little city. You have LA, you have San Francisco, San Diego, but very much in between it's kind of scattered, and the Sierra is just all mountains, basically, until you get over to Nevada. So for me, personally, I think there are still grizzly bears out there. They're just deep in the forests, and they're hiding from people because they don't want to be killed, right? So I wrote this story about grizzly bears, but it was a short story, and I just walked into an exhibit, and it gave me the inspiration just to write about the grizzly bear. And it's a story that takes place in the 1800s, and it's called The Last Grizzly. You can read the story free on my website. But it's when I write historical fantasy. You've heard of historical fiction. I write historical fantasy. Like for this series here, the Prowley series. Prowley is an actual place in Italy. It's right on the French border there, up in the mountains. So I use real cities and sometimes real historical characters, and I weave fantasy into it. And you don't really see that. You see a lot of historical fiction, like Ben-Hur's historical fiction. So to write a story, first of all, you have to have an idea. And it doesn't have to be a great idea. If you write short stories, okay, I've started writing a short story and realized, you know, this story is not, it's bigger than a short story. I end up writing a whole novel out of it. So it just depends on, you know, what you're really focusing on, short stories or long story, you know, or novels. I say, don't go into a writing project thinking this is gonna be a short story. Just go into it thinking, I'm gonna write this story. And just continue to write until you are satisfied with yourself that it is finished. Okay, and if you ever get published, which is a good chance, and nowadays it can happen, that you'll continue to read it, and a story is never finished to you. Just like George Lucas. Star Wars will never be finished in his mind. And unfortunately, he has shown this to the rest of the world. Because the original Star Wars, awesome, fantastic, great. Harrison Ford, Carrie Fisher, great 3 movies. But in George Lucas' mind, he wasn't finished. But Star Wars was so successful, he said, well, I'm not finished, I'll do more. And he made 3 more movies, but they're complete rubbish, okay? And then he takes the old ones and adds things in there that didn't have to be in there to begin with, and he's just adding more and more and more. To us, the original was perfection, but to him it never will be. And when you're writing a story, you'll never have a perfect story. You'll never finish a story and say, this is perfection. You'll always see your writings when you're finished with it and say, I can do more of this, I can work. My advice to you is don't get caught up in that. Write your story, finish it the first time. Once it's finished, that's it. Go off to another subject, another story, because no story will ever satisfy your needs completely. And there is no such thing as a perfect story, ever. To your readers, it might be perfect. And that's the only thing that counts, is readers. And going into that, don't write for people. Never write for people. Always write for just you. When I'm writing strictly just for me. Okay? I'm writing what I want to write, what I want to do, and I don't care what anyone thinks of it. I don't. And if they don't like it, they don't have to buy it. That's it. If they don't like it, they don't have to go on my website and read it. Like we say in the United States, if you don't like something on TV, turn off the channel. Why censor it? If people want to see it, they can continue watching. If you don't like it, just turn it off. Same thing with reading. You don't know how many books I've read and like, okay, whatever. You know, and sometimes you'll even do that with your own stories. They go, oh, I wrote this 5 years ago, let me check it out. Oh my God. You know, it just happens, right? For me, my major influence is Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. Those are the 2 I grew up with. I really didn't get into C.S. Lewis until later, like in my high school years. Tolkien, I read The Hobbit when I was like 5. To any fantasy writer, depending on what kind of genre you write, for a fantasy writer, Tolkien is like the god of all fantasy and inspiration for us. Without Tolkien, there really wouldn't be fantasy. Okay. And in fact, you can buy little Hobbit books, little Bible, tiny size with gold edges, and carry it around with you wherever you go. And fantasy writers, a lot of them, or people who love fantasy in general, The Hobbit, if there was no Bible that existed, The Hobbit would be the Bible for fantasy. And when they came out with the movie, I was ecstatic, and also kind of sad too, because they added stuff in there they shouldn't have. But I still think Peter Jackson is genius. So basically, when you're writing a story, begin with what you want to write about, what kind of genre. It's a story that you want to write for yourself. Just write it for yourself. Also, when you're writing characters, know all about the characters before you write the story. Like for the Crowley series, The Monk, I wrote his name and also where he lived, what he ate, what type of clothes. For a monk, that's easy, only one type of clothing. but you write it in description, down from the brown habit to the rope around his waist and the rosary beads on the side, what kind of fabric, all those details, even going down to the point of what was his mother's name, what was his father's name, how did they get married, how did they meet. When you start writing a biography for each character, you can already begin in your mind to see your story, your outline, already expanding tremendously just by each biography. And just by me talking about it, it's expanding naturally in your mind. Like in this book series I have here, Mary Archer is an English girl, but she moves to Italy because of religious persecution in England. And I write where she lived, Lancashire, England, which I love because that's where my family's from. Her eye color, her hair, her skin, the texture and how soft it is, you know, even down to her blemishes of her skin and how white her skin is, and her father and what her father did for a living, what her mother did, and in my story, the father was mentioned, but he died before the incidents in the book place. So you write about how he died, how it affected her, and how these effects on her affect her today, and how her father's death, clouds her judgments on certain things, and you write all this down. And once you get all these biographies down, when you start writing the story, it almost writes itself, in a sense. And you need to have those biographies on the side, because sometimes you'll forget something, right? And that happens quite often. So you always have to have them on the side saying, that doesn't sound just right. And always go by your first instinct. If you're writing something and you say to yourself, wow, that doesn't seem right, 99% of the time it's not right. Go back and you check to make sure it's right. Because you don't want to write something like, she had a green belt around her waist in chapter 1. In chapter 12, last battle scene, let's say, and she whipped off her red belt, and, well, wait a minute, it was green in the first chapter. So those are the little details that you have to, make sure you get. And nowadays, it happens a lot. Even with published books, I can go through any published book in the United States and find at least 2 errors in every book, okay? Now, I can't go through Harry Potter because I've never read Harry Potter. Forgive me. Forgive me.
I am leaving right now. Why do I even listen to you?
But I'm more. There's these 2 groups of fantasy. There's the Tolkien people that are the more traditional, and then you have the Harry Potter, which is the new guard of fantasy. So I'm raised in that old guard of fantasy, and I'm very, very much Tolkien Lewis. They're my inspiration. But I do have to say this Vampires of Proudly that I have here was actually my anti-Twilight book. I'm sorry to say, because I grew up with vampires. It was Christopher Lee, the actor Christopher Lee in the Hammer films was my vampire, and Bela Lugosi. Vampires are walking dead who suck blood. They're not people who go to high school and date girls. They're not guys who go to the school parking lot, rip off their shirt, and the sun's glistening off their chest, and they're like, oh my God. Those are not vampires. So in this book, I have real vampires, and I state in the book, not so bluntly, but I say that people who think they're vampires, who go out and do the things I just mentioned, they're not really vampires. They're familiar. They're people who want to be vampires, or they're people who work for vampires. Very much like the Blade series in regards to vampires, how he had humans, the humans were working underlings for vampires, and that's how they are here. So what I was stating in my book was Twilight wasn't actually a vampire story, it was a story of familiars thinking they're vampires. So that was my knock on Twilight, because I'm very traditional with my vampires as well. And I don't think you'll ever see a vampire walking around, you know, during the daylight, you know, buying a Coke. That just doesn't happen. You know what I mean? So, so yeah, write what you want to write. Just make sure you have all the biographies, and make sure you double check everything. Now, when you're writing, if you want to write a novel, you have to do at least 12 chapters. That's usually the formula, is 12 chapters. Now, unless you're Tolstoy, you know, you're usually not going to write 12 chapters. Usually you can get everything down within 12 chapters. My books are not giant books, and there's a reason for that. I write for the American audience. I have to compliment, you know, people in Europe, at least, well, not Western Europe, but Eastern Europe. You guys read a lot more than we do. You're a literary society, and you can pick up, I think, A War and Peace and probably enjoy it. For Americans, it's torture, okay? And for Americans, usually anything over 200, 250 pages, they're just going to toss it, or they're not going to buy it, okay? So, yes?
You know, we just been tortured by it in high school, so we've already prepared
we
for
had
stuff
to
like
read
this.
it.
Yeah, it's like we have to do it.
We had to learn to enjoy it.
Well,
I kind of like thick books, because, you know, when you start reading those short ones, you just start enjoying it and it just finishes.
Yeah,
Sure.
and when it finishes
Oh,
quickly.
Sure.
Character, you just want to know his or her life.
Sure. Well, here's what I write, because what I write is I write YA, okay? That means young adult. Well, Harry Potter's YA, right? Twilight's YA. And it's very popular now, but that's who I write for. You know, teenagers or people in their early 20s. And for Americans who are at that age, it is almost impossible for them to even pick up a book unless they have to study in class. You know, really, it's like pulling teeth. So I've taken an idea done by Tolkien. Write 3 books. Once you've written 3 books between 150 to 200 pages, even though his books go longer. After you release those, then what you do is you combine all 3 and re-release them with a new title. Like Tolkien had Fellowship of the Ring, Return of the King, 2 Towers, right? And then he brought them all together and called it Lord of the Rings, right? So I'm doing the same thing. The dragon of Prowley, Wizard of Prowley, Vampires of Prowley, combining it together into one book, which should be out next year. I'm hoping if I get it done by this Christmas. And then I'm calling it The Defenders of Prowley, okay? Now, as a writer, I know I have people hooked, okay? I'm doing lectures, I'm doing book signings at Barnes & Noble, all of this. So they're already buying my book. But if these people have already written my book, see it as just a re-release, they won't buy it. So what you do is you change the title and they buy it for a second time. So
They don't look inside before buying them?
so you get their money twice. A lot of people don't. Believe it or not, a lot of Americans look at a cover.
American.
Yeah, a lot of times Americans will look at a cover. Cover looks great. Buy the book. And that's it. So you always have to have a great cover. When you're writing a book and you want to get it published, also hire a great artist as well. I've never hired an American artist.
Why not?
The first artist for the first 2 books of this series was she was from Russia, but her father was from like a Latin American country, and she lived in Belgium, right? Very international. But my series is very international. I don't write American stories. I think out of all my stories, I think only 2 of them have ever taken place in America. All my stories happen in Europe, because I'm writing for usually stories that take place in the Middle Ages, and Europe is where it was at, right? I mean, not much was happening in the United States during the Middle Ages. I mean, you had the Indian culture there. And,
No vampires.
yeah,
No
exactly.
castles.
Yeah. So yeah, so that's you just put the whole book together after the 3 books, and Tolkien taught me that, and Lewis did that as well, but he did it with 7 books, right? The Chronicles of Narnia. So that's a tool that you can use to resell a book twice, especially to Americans who just look at covers. You know, and so always pick a good artist as well. It helps if you don't have to pay the artist. Okay, I came from a comic book convention, and once you start getting the conventions here all the time, right? You'll meet artists at these conventions, and you can talk to them and say, look, I'm going to publish this book.